LinkedIn now has over 1 billion members worldwide, and if that's where your ideal listener hangs out, then your podcast should be on there too. But growing your podcast on LinkedIn isn't as easy as just sharing a link each week. And that's why in this episode, I invited Mr. LinkedIn himself, Mark Williams, to speak to us about his podcast, Informed, and give us the lowdown on how to grow a podcast using LinkedIn. And in this episode, we cover Mark's secrets to a successful podcast after 10 plus years in the game, how to grow your following on LinkedIn and drive more traffic to your podcast, the power of forming the right relationships with your audience, AI pitfalls to avoid in LinkedIn, why Mark was forced to change his podcast name, and how he made the best of it. If you want to grow your LinkedIn following and your podcast, then don't miss this episode. Mark Williams, thank you for joining me on Podcasting Amplified. How are you doing today?
It's a pleasure. I'm doing great, thank you. I'm surviving the terrible wind and rain that we have where I currently am at the moment. It's the most horrendous day. But hopefully we can't hear that on the recording.
No, it's all good. We're getting it here as well anyway, but I've had to shut all the vents and everything.
Not a day for outside video or audio for that matter.
So Mark provides insights, news, feature updates and expert interviews for LinkedIn enthusiasts on his podcast, Informed Podcast by Mark Williams. You'll find it on Spotify, iTunes, everywhere where you get your podcasts. Mark's an independent LinkedIn trainer, and he's been providing this content for about 10 years now, is it?
2013 was when I said just over 10 years, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay. And over 400 episodes in now. So how did it start? When did you first start out training with LinkedIn? And then when did you decide that the podcast was the way to go for your content?
Yeah, so LinkedIn training was 2008, back end of 2008. And it's a long time ago for LinkedIn that. I mean, they started in 2003, but 2008, I remember in my first workshop, proudly announcing, but thinking that it was impressive to announce that LinkedIn had 35 million members. They've just gone over 1 billion last year. It's just, that puts it into context, doesn't it, in terms of how long ago it was. So that was 2008. The podcasting thing came obviously a little bit later in 2013. There's a number of things that impacted that. But first of all, from my perspective, I had become a big podcast consumer. And so I kind of, was your typical person that would listen to the radio in the car and da-da-da-da and all that kind of stuff. And got fed up, just listening to somebody else's agenda and stumbled across podcasts, I think, and started to realize that actually I could listen to what I wanted to when I wanted to. And so I started consuming all kinds of different podcasts, including ones around internet marketing and how to, develop your brand online and all the rest of it, and personal branding and all kinds of things. I used it as a self-improvement tool, really. And because of that being the case with me, I was using it for entertainment purposes as well. So there's some podcasts I listened to that were just purely entertainment. I thought, well, hold on a second. What I'm doing in my job here is I'm helping people improve what they do as a business, by using LinkedIn. And a great way of being able to learn that would be potentially to do that via a podcast. So that's kind of how the idea came about initially. I had no idea about podcasting at all, really, in terms of the mechanics of how to do it. But I'm one of the people that I was listening to was Pat Flynn. I don't listen to his podcast anymore. I haven't done for years, but back in the day, kind of 2012 time, that was one of the main shows that I listened to, Smart Passive Income, I think it was called. Is that right?
Yeah, that's the one.
I actually met him at Social Media Marketing World just very briefly. That was a big influence on me in terms of the kind of stuff that he was covering at the time that was of interest to me. But then, of course, he also had put together a series of videos showing you how to do a podcast, basically, which was a completely free resource that he'd put out and clearly spent a lot of time and effort doing it. And it was invaluable to me because just followed the steps right the way through, learned all about, hosting and microphones and blah, 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 all the rest of it. And started, experimenting with it. I thought when I first started, I thought, I don't quite know how anybody's going to ever find out about this. How on earth are people, what's the discoverability, how is that actually going to happen? And so I sort of made the mistake of, well, I wouldn't say it was a mistake, but I think it's natural when you first start, because you think, how's anybody ever going to find this podcast? I mean, there weren't as many podcasts around in those days as there are now, but even so, there was still, a lot on the, what was then called the iTunes charts. So I was going on LinkedIn and stuff and putting out, I'm doing this episode. This is what I'm going to be talking about. Blah blah blah. I don't really know if it made an awful lot of difference, but it certainly didn't help me in terms of what I was trying to do on LinkedIn, to be promoting something in that way, which is something that I would discourage people from doing. But it was an interesting experience for me at the time, because I was thinking, I don't know how anybody's going to find it. How do I get the word out there? But it's amazing how once you start capturing an audience, it doesn't take very many people, and then word starts spreading, and on you go from there. And I said to myself, if I can, there was a thing at the time, it's probably still a thing now, called pod fade. I don't know if that's a term you've ever come across. And I think pod fade at the time that I heard about it was about 7 episodes, I think. The average was about 7 episodes or something like that, meaning people quit after 7 episodes on average. And I thought, right, okay, so I'm going to set myself a target way above that. I'm going to get to 20. And if I get to 20 and I really don't feel that it's doing anything for me or the business, so I'm not enjoying it and the business isn't benefiting from it, then I'll just quit. But I'll give it 20. I think 7's not enough to make any judgment, and it's going to take a bit of time for people to start to understand what it is and who I am. So that's what I did, really. I gave it the first 20, and by the time I got there, I wouldn't have said that I was getting any business benefit from it, particularly, or nothing noticeable, but I was really enjoying it. And what I found was that, this thing about content and building your personal brand around your content always felt a bit, I wouldn't say alien, but a struggle with written content. I'm not a good typist. I'm not a touch typist. I have things that I want to say and ideas that I want to put across, but having to sit and type them up was just a drag for me. I just found that really, really unenjoyable, basically, and frustrating. And so what I found in that first 20 episodes was that this medium of podcasting was just allowing me to do what I do best, really, which is just talk, and just express myself. And so that's kind of why I continued, because, I was really enjoying it. I hadn't seen any great benefit from a business point of view at that stage, but I was enjoying that. And it felt like a much better way for me anyway, of getting content out there. I remember when I first started sort of seeking advice, I didn't know anybody that did a podcast. It was more of a rarity then. So from a local kind of, or not local, but, people that I knew in business, I didn't know anybody else that did a podcast. And, but there was a podcasting group. Do you know, I should have looked this up before we did this, as to who it was. I can't remember their names, which is really rude of me. It's something I've not been involved in for a long, long time. They had a Facebook group. It was in the UK. And they had like an awards ceremony that they put together. And I actually won I've got it here. UK Podcasters Award 2015.
Oh, nice.
See that. To be honest, I don't think there were that many entries for my category, which is probably why I won it. But anyway, that group was interesting in that that was other podcasters, obviously, that I could talk to and ask questions and sort of swap ideas. But I actually found that community was useful, but only to a point. In that what I found podcasting was in those days was there was I still think it's probably the case today. There are kind of two different types of podcasters. There were people like me who, you know, weren't audio people, experienced in audio, not technical. You know, I wouldn't know one microphone from another when I first started, or, you know, when someone started talking about using mixers and I was like, what, you know, that's way beyond me. I don't want to get into all that technical stuff. And I would say probably 70% of that community were like that. And then the other 30% were people like me who just had no idea. The other people were very technical, you know, kind of passion for audio. And so it was useful to a point, but I did find myself thinking, what I don't want to do with this podcast is get drawn into, you know, being obsessed with it sounding perfect and mixing and different things that I could use to make the sound perfect and blah, blah, blah. You know, that to me wasn't the point, and high levels of editing or anything like that really wasn't the point of why I was doing it. What I wanted to do, and the intention always from day one, was to connect with my audience. So the audience was already there. This was just a chance to connect and build a relationship with them. And I remember one piece of advice that I received. It was actually someone in the group had put me onto something, and I really don't remember what this, I think it was actually a video, it might have been on YouTube. And it was someone talking about podcasting, and it was a tip. And I remembered this very clearly. This is before I started. And they said, before you record an interview, sorry, not an interview, any podcast, just before you record, right? Sit down, close your eyes, and imagine that you are sat in a very comfortable place that's very familiar to you. It could be your lounge or your local pub or whatever. You're warm and comfortable and in a seat that is very comfortable, that you've sat in many times before. It's very specific detail, this. And then imagine that sat next to you in another chair is someone that you know really well, like someone that when you greet them, you would hug them, not shake their hand or say hello. Someone that you would call a really close friend that you've known for many years. And imagine them sat there and you both got a drink in your hands and you're just catching up, right? And think about that. This is all with your eyes closed again. And then open your eyes and press record and now start talking. And nice. That's exactly what I did for about the first 10 episodes. I went through that exact process for about the first 10 episodes, roughly. I mean, it might have been slightly less than that, but yeah. And I found that just got me into, I think a lot of people these days that you know, if you're like fans of the podcast, people that listen to the podcast a lot, often say to me, the thing they like most is that they feel they really know me and they feel like I'm a friend. And I won't put it all down to that, but I think starting off on that track was really valuable advice and a really valuable thing for me to do. And it made it much more enjoyable for me. So sometimes I meet people who are kind of starting out in podcasting or ask for some advice about podcasting. And that's something I always tell them. And it's also one of the things that I notice people do wrong. A lot of the people that I met in that group, when I listened to their podcasts, a lot of them were sort of people very experienced in the radio industry and things like that. So like DJs and people like that. But it was a real performance what they were doing. So they would typically be very kind of, hey, welcome to the podcast and da-da-da-da-da, and we are going to do this today, you know. And the thing about that is that I think that's great in certain mediums. But the thing about, for me anyway, about audio and podcasting is that what I really want my audience to do is get that nice, warm, familiar, comfortable feeling that they're just sitting down, they're going out for a walk, taking the dog for a walk, going out for a run, driving the car somewhere, and they switch on, and I'm with them. We're there together. If they're driving the car, I'm sat in the other seat, and we're just having a chat, and I'm just talking about LinkedIn to them. And I think that as a medium to influence people, I think that's very, very powerful.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for sharing your journey. And yeah, I think that could be really helpful for people who are struggling, even if they're not new, but they still might struggle with getting into that mindset. They might get nervous before they record, or they might feel like they have to put on a certain persona. And then, yeah, I think you can tell when you speak to somebody, or when I speak to somebody, and then I listen to their podcast, if it feels like I'm listening to a different person, it is much less engaging. Like speaking to you on this recording, and before we started recording and listening to your podcast, you just sound like Mark. So I think it helps get that familiarity and build that sort of friendship from afar, so to speak.
Yeah, I think, if you were to ask my parents, they would always say, when I was a kid and at school and stuff, they would say, Mark loves the sound of his own voice. And I think that's probably quite an ideal scenario to have, to be a podcaster.
Yeah.
I genuinely look forward every week to when I record the podcast. There are some struggles with it, which, challenges with it, which we can come on to. But despite those, I still, even for me, as the person recording it and putting it out there, when I'm in my office, in front of the microphone, chatting about LinkedIn, is when I'm in the zone and I feel at my most comfortable, written content, trying to get a point of view across by the form of writing just isn't me, just doesn't feel natural. And it's always forcing it when I try and do that. So,
yeah, I know exactly what you mean. It's kind of the same for me. That's why I started a YouTube channel and podcast and everything. And luckily, that kind of content, written and audio, converts better anyway than written content typically. So that's all good. And
I think the thing about written content is people can get a sense of. I mean, some people prefer written content. There's something I've had to learn. That if you want to reach everyone, some people just not going to listen to podcasts, and so it's important to have some written content as well. Some people like it, but I'm not sure it's as easy to build a relationship with people. I think one of the things that in podcasting is easy to forget is that we get. I'm actually thinking back to Pat Flynn. I always remember he used to say, everybody always asks me about, how can I get more of an audience? How can I build my audience? Blah, blah, blah. He said, look, your privileged position is that even if you've got, 100 people that listen to your podcast, and you might think those figures are rubbish in comparison to what Pat Flynn gets. But imagine if you were every week stood up talking to 100 people every single week, you consider that to be quite a big deal. Right. But just because it's through a podcast, you think that's rubbish. Only 100 people listen to my podcast. That's amazing. You're speaking to 100 people. But the privilege is that you're not just speaking to them as you would. I mean, the analogy he gave was if you were stood up speaking to an audience of 100 people, but it's not that. It's much more intimate than that. I'm in the earbuds of each individual for a whole hour, every week. So an hour of their week is dedicated to listening to me, right? I mean, that is a real privilege. And I don't think there is any other means of content that allows you to develop a relationship with an audience in that way. Video's the nearest thing, but the thing with video is you can't multitask videos. So you don't get that, or it's harder to multitask video anyway. So you don't get that scenario of someone's out there going for a walk, driving the car, and listening to you at the same time. That is less likely to happen, certainly in the car anyway. You'd hope so.
Yeah. Yeah, and you got in quite early with LinkedIn by the sounds of it, and with podcasting. It doesn't seem like that long ago, 10 years, but in sort of digital and online content terms, it's a very long time. But you say about you weren't sure about the discoverability. I feel like that hasn't really improved all that much. Even now, I think it still can be quite hard to get discovered on LinkedIn. Sorry, on the the apps. So you have to put in a lot of work. How has your sort of promotion grown over those 10 years to get it out there, or is it just based on the fact that you're building that LinkedIn following and people find you through there? Are you doing specific things to market the podcast or just for your own personal brand?
Yeah, so originally, as I say, I did used to, I've been through various stages of this. I did used to kind of go, this week I'm going to be covering this, and this, to my audience on LinkedIn on the hope that they would want to listen to the show. And that didn't really work. And the pushback that I got on that was, don't tell us what you're going to do, tell us what you have done. Which I thought was quite interesting, actually. I thought, I don't know, I was sort of making comparisons with radio and television where, you'll see promotions of next week, tune in too, and that didn't seem to work at all. People found that quite frustrating. People wanted content that they could consume straight away, not I want to think, oh, right, so your podcast comes out on Saturday, so I've got to remember to go and listen to it after Saturday. Yeah. No, I don't want that. I want something, tell me about something I can do right now. I don't know if that's a social media factor or what that is, but that didn't work talking in advance of things. So then I started sort of more promoting after the event. And so I'd talk about what I covered. That didn't really work either because it was promotional. And also I used to do the thing where there used to be an app, you'll probably know it, where, you can take a snippet of your podcast and it's a video, and it has like kind of sound waves on it and stuff like that. And I tried all of that. Didn't really work either, to be honest. It was just a slightly different looking promotional post. When I came to the realization, of course, the problem here is what I'm trying to do is, it's very obvious what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to get people to listen to my podcasts, and people don't want you to try and get them to do anything. That's just not human nature, right? So what they want is something that's valuable to them. And of course, the podcast is valuable to them. But if I tell them that it's valuable to them and I tell them they should tune in and listen, then I'm trying to get them to do something. And people don't want that. So I realized that the right way to do this was actually to put the content out. And so I kind of converted to, and there were changes going on with LinkedIn at the time that facilitated this, in that there'd always been, well, not always, but for a long time, there'd been articles on LinkedIn, long form content. And that kind of medium would have suited talking about what you're covering in a podcast more than, say, a post, which is shorter form content, because the post inevitably would just highlight some areas and then ask people to listen to the podcast, whereas you could cover the whole content, effectively show notes, through long form. But with articles on LinkedIn, the discoverability of them was an absolute nightmare. It was really, really hard to get anybody to see your long form content. But then they brought out newsletters, and this kind of coincided with where I was with marketing the podcast or trying to attract an audience to it. So I sort of realized that by creating a newsletter for the podcast, then I could get people to subscribe to that newsletter. And then every week they would get notifications and an email, and embedded in that email would be the show notes for the podcast. And so what I found through that process was that I was appealing to those people that would never listen to a podcast and want their content in written format. And at the same time, I was also enticing other people to try out the podcast. So in the podcast, in the show notes, or in the article in the newsletter, is a way. It's not an embed, because you can't embed onto LinkedIn articles, unfortunately. With it has worked with Spotify in the past, but it doesn't currently. So it's literally just a screenshot of the embed. and then a link, right? So it's just screenshot and a linking of the image, So it's a bit of a faffy way of doing it, if you like, but hey, it's all you can do on LinkedIn at the moment. And so they can listen to it there and then in the show notes, or click on it and go to Spotify. And then, of course, maybe if they use Spotify elsewhere, they may well then subscribe. And so you do get more people subscribing to the podcast as a result of doing that. Also, the show notes are not comprehensive at all. They are a brief summary. Even then, they're quite often, one of the things about LinkedIn with articles is they say how many minute read it is, which obviously can really put people off if it's too long. But sometimes they can be 7, 8, 9 minute read. But even so, obviously, a 7, 8, 9 minute read is nothing like the whole podcast, which is an hour on average, about an hour long. So it's not a transcript by any stretch of imagination. I've been through stages where I've tried the transcripting thing, but that never really worked for me. It's far too much work to sort of edit that and put it together. And again, just far too long. Who wants to read an hour of talking? It's just far too much. So it's often just bullet points, summary with kind of things that I've learned from it, or that I feel are important points to put across. And also, of course, the normal show notes thing with a podcast like mine. I'm talking about a visual thing, LinkedIn, a website. So I need to show screenshots and some videos and stuff like that. So obviously it gives me the chance to embed all that into it as well, as you would expect in show notes from a podcast. So that has been one way of attracting more of an audience. But to be honest with you, Joe, the vast majority of my audience has just come organically, just word of mouth and just that way.
Yeah. It seems like you didn't really have to do as much as some podcasters do or feel they might need to, because you were already in that space building your personal brand. And, if they want more, then they'll find it.
Yeah. So so if I was doing a podcast for, I don't know, teachers, that would be difficult, right? So how am I going to get a teacher to realize that there's a podcast about teachers, right? For teachers. Well, but on LinkedIn, of course, I'm out there on LinkedIn actively building, an audience, quite a large audience. And I'm talking to them about the fact that I do a podcast, and that is, the way that they get to know. So yeah, I think that's definitely an advantage that I've got over other people, for sure.
Do you use any other kind of social media? I know obviously you spend a lot of time on LinkedIn, which makes sense, but have you tried expanding to other kinds of social media for it?
In the past I have, but never really found that anything worked at all.
No.
But basically, obviously Twitter in the early days, in my early days anyway, I was a fairly active user of Twitter, but then just became a consumer. Facebook never really appealed, and very quickly became obvious that they were just an advertising company. So the only way of reaching anybody was through advertising. Same with Instagram. So no, I know people that more recently have experimented with other things like TikTok and stuff like that. But I guess for me, I've already got a strong audience on LinkedIn. I could definitely see an argument for doing that. If I was sitting down with someone starting tomorrow, I would probably advise them to do that. It hasn't been necessary for me. And I think, the thing with social media is that you've always got another platform, or there's a multitude of different platforms, and you can try and cover them all and spread yourself too thinly. You've got to think about how much time you've got for social media amongst everything else that you're doing, where you want to put that time, And to me, it just became fairly obvious that I was much better off spending more time engaging with people and building relationships on LinkedIn than I was kind of trying to cover lots of different social media platforms.
Yeah, I mean, for you, it obviously makes sense because it is a social media platform, and it's also the people on there, they use LinkedIn, so they're going to be your target audience. And then, if someone had a Facebook ads podcast, then they'd be spending more time on Facebook. But I'm sure there are a lot of podcasters who could probably benefit from being on LinkedIn who aren't. That, just because they might not see it yet as something to promote that kind of content. Can you talk to some of the benefits of simply using LinkedIn to grow your personal brand for those and your podcast for those who might not have considered jumping in on LinkedIn yet?
Yeah, I mean, my guess would be that typically people will be on LinkedIn, but not really using it in a way that would perhaps enhance their podcast audience or help them grow their podcast audience. And I think if you looked at it as, okay, I'm going to start using LinkedIn now because I want to grow my audience, and that's your focus, then that would be making the mistake that I made. So the real way to do it is to think, look, my audience are on LinkedIn. They will be. There's over 1 billion people on LinkedIn. They'll be on LinkedIn, right? Some of them may be more active than others, but there will be a percentage of my audience, my potential audience and my current audience that are on LinkedIn and active. And what I want to try and do is use that platform as a way of engaging with them. So I want to be able to join and create conversations on topics that I know are of interest to this community. Your LinkedIn is obviously one big community, but effectively broken down into lots and lots of cohorts of people that are interested in specific subjects. And most of that is dominated by content. So, you know, whatever that audience is and whatever they're interested in, finds opportunities to engage with them around those subjects. Now, obviously, your profile will talk about the podcast and what you do and all the branding and all the stuff that, you know, is not specific to LinkedIn that you would do elsewhere. And make it very, very clear. Make sure there are plenty of links in your profile. Make sure you use your featured section in your profile to link to your podcast, et cetera, et cetera. But through that activity and building networks and connecting with the right kind of people, you become more and more visible, and people are drawn into your profile and the discoverability, therefore, of your podcast. So it's very much that way around. It's like the best way to describe it is, imagine if this was not online at all. So, you know, whatever it is that you're trying to, for want of a better word, promote or make people more aware of. Let's imagine that there is no LinkedIn, there is no internet. My way of doing that would be to go to events, right? So I'm going to go to a networking event or a conference or something of that nature where there's a lot of people, of the right type of people in the room. And so when I walk in that room, the mistake that I made and that a lot of people make is you walk in the room and you start going, hey, can I just stop everyone? I just want you to know about this, right? I know you don't know me, but I've got this, right? And I want you to know about it. So let me tell you about it, right? In effect, that's what a lot of people do. But because it's social media, they just don't perceive it as being the same as that. But it absolutely is. And nobody wants to know. Nobody cares, right? So they're not going to listen to you. That whole load of people in that room that you've walked into are just going to look over and go, who's that weirdo in the corner speaking to himself, right? Because nobody wants to hear you. Of course, you wouldn't do that. What you'd actually do is you'd walk into the room and you'd go suss it out a bit, and then you go and start mingling and talking to people. But when you talk to them, even one-on-one or one to a small group, again, you're not going to go, sorry, can I just interrupt? Let me tell you all about my podcast. It's really good, da-da-da-da. And what we talk about is this. They're just going to be like, hold on a second. Don't even know who you are. So obviously you're not going to do that. You're going to introduce yourself. You're going to find out more about them. You're going to, you know, 2 ears and 1 mouth, show more interest in them than telling them about you. Wait for them to ask questions about you. Normal, good networking and communication skills. If you take that approach to LinkedIn, yes, your main aim, big picture is that you want people to know about your podcast. But the way you do that is by becoming part of a community and contributing to that community, helping other people, and, you know, putting out content that is of genuine interest to your target audience, of which part of that, of course, is your podcast. That's the way to do it. You know, if I had my time again, that's the way I would go about from day one. You know, like most people, you learn from trial and error, but certainly that was my experience. And that's what I would say, not just with podcasting, anything really. If you want to make a name on LinkedIn, you do it by being focused on your audience.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, well, hopefully people can learn from that if they're just starting out on LinkedIn about, you know, getting involved in in conversations that people are already having and sort of adding your value rather than just trying to promote. And I guess also being really intentional on who is in your network rather than just clicking connect on everyone. If you're going to be sharing something, it's sort of like building your own, Facebook group in a way that, if you post something there, people are going to be interested. So if you're connecting with the right people, and not wasting those impressions that are kind of hard to come by if you don't pay for them anyway these days.
Yeah, to a degree. I mean, there's two elements to that. A part of it is about who you connect to, and I wouldn't encourage people to connect to completely irrelevant people. But also, it's not just about connecting to people that are your target audience. It's also people that might potentially be connected to your target audience as well. Yeah. The algorithm will figure out a way of making sure that when you put out content, the people that see it are the people that are likely to be interested in it. And through their actions and your actions and building relevance with those people, people. There's two elements to building a network. One is who you connect with. The other is about what you do, the actions that you take. So if you are on LinkedIn and you are acting in a way that's telling the algorithm, training the algorithm that these are my kind of people, and that their actions in response to your actions say, we like this sounds good, I'm interested, I'm going to reply to this message, I'm going to comment on this person's post. The more of that happens, the algorithm will start to go, okay, these people are highly relevant to each other. So yes, who you connect with, but also what you do to make sure, because the reality is that I don't know how many connections I've got, maybe 12,000, something like that. There's no way they see my content. Hardly any of them see my content, but the ones that do are the ones that are most likely to be interested in it, and them as well, and that's kind of where you need to get to through activity.
Okay. Yeah. So the algorithm hopefully do you some favors there as well.
The kind of humorous way to put that point is, quick story. I remember once going to an event. This has happened to me loads of times actually, but one in particular I always remember. Sitting down and just chatting to someone. What do you do, Mark? And I said, LinkedIn training. And they said, oh yeah, I'm on LinkedIn. I've been on LinkedIn for years, but it's gone to the dogs. It's awful. It's just gone like Facebook. People are just posting pictures of their pets and their holidays, and that's not what LinkedIn should be. LinkedIn should be all about business. And I go, that's interesting. So just out of interest, when you see a post like that, what do you do? Do you just ignore it, or do you comment on it, or like it? Or I'm certainly not going to like it, she said. But I'll often put a comment and say, this should not be here. This should be on Facebook. I'm like, well, that's why you're seeing all that content. Because the message to the algorithm is, I want to see more. I'm commenting on this post, but that's the opposite of what I'm talking about, right? So comment on the things that you want to see, put out content that is engaging, that makes the people that you're interested in want to comment on your posts, and then they see more of your stuff. And understanding that that's how it works is kind of a big element of being successful on LinkedIn.
Yeah. And on that, I understand why people don't want to get too personal LinkedIn, but at the same time, if you can sort of make it almost relevant and show occasionally that you are a human being, I mean, I guess that can help get the right kind of...
Yeah, more than helps, Joe. Personal content comes in all shapes and sizes, but the kind of sweet spot of content to me is where you're talking about a subject that may be business related or related to what you do, and related to being something that would be relevant, interesting, useful in the jobs of the people that you're looking to reach, in the job that they do, but delivering it in a personal way. So, I could talk about, if you want to be successful, what you need to do is, you need to comment on posts that you want to see, and don't comment on posts that you don't want to see. I could tell that in a very factual way, or I could tell you a story about the time I went to an event, sat down with a woman, and she spoke to me. And do you know what I mean? When you personalize the story, when you make it, this is me, this is my experience, something that happened to me. there's a story in my profile, which I won't repeat now, but if someone wants to read it, you go to my profile on LinkedIn. But and it's just about how someone was quite rude about the fact that I was a LinkedIn trainer when I first started, which was an odd thing at the time because nobody else was a LinkedIn trainer, certainly in the UK. And I recount the story because it shows vulnerability in me. It shows determination to prove someone wrong. It shows elements of my character that are very authentically me, right? And those kind of stories, when delivered in that way, are very sticky. People remember them forever. People, so often I meet people and they go, did you ever go back to that lawyer guy, by the way? And first of all, I have to take a step back sometimes and go, oh, you're talking about that story on my profile. They just suddenly come out. Did you ever go back to that lawyer guy that was rude to you? And I'm like, oh, yeah, that story. Things like that are. So that's what I call personal content, personalizing a message. It's coming from me. It's something that happened to me. I want to share this with you because, that kind of content is really powerful on LinkedIn. Now, I'm also absolutely fine. So if that's the sweet spot where business crosses over with personal, there's obviously some stuff that's purely business and some stuff that's just purely personal. And they're fine as well, as long as they don't dominate. The majority of content needs to be kind of a cross between the two.
Yeah, and I guess it's the kind of having that personal element is the kind of content that they haven't just put it together with AI, which is kind of a recent problem, but not looking like every single other post that's just been, please generate me 25 LinkedIn posts about such and such if you want it to be a bit more unique.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you brought up AI because there's an interesting angle to that. So when I talk to people about, look, if you comment on posts that you want to see, you're going to see more of that content. If you can do that, then you're going to build relevance with the author of that post and you're going to see more of their content. But if they reply to your comment, then they're more likely to see more of your content as well. And that's a good technique. So, of course, the internet marketer, AI geek decides that they're going to start to create a tool that automatically comments for you, right? So it'll do a search, find relevant posts based on keyword searches, and then automatically just comment on them without you even just press a button. Isn't life easy? But of course, what happens the back end of that is that I do a post, I look down the comments, and you see these comments, and they quote words and sentences from the original post, and they're just awful, right? And they're so obvious.
Yeah.
And so you go, I understand what you're doing, but there's two elements to this. You're training the algorithm, and that is going to be beneficial to you. I get that. But you're also telling the audience that you're a robot and that you're represented by a robot. And nobody thinks that's clever. People look at that and just go, yeah, that doesn't really tell me anything about you. And so, yes, you're doing one thing, but you're not representing yourself in a true, authentic way. And that's not effective at all. So you're never going to lose that human element in communication. And that's important to everyone. So I'm not anti-AI at all. I think it can be very useful in the right circumstances. People always go too far with this stuff, don't they? And just want to press a button and let a machine do everything for them.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, a couple of years ago or less, if you saw some posts, some replies that looked like an AI had written it, you'd think the whole account is just a bot account and probably, flag it, report it or whatever.
Yeah.
And it just kind of adds even more noise that you've got to sift through with your comments now as well and find something that's actually worth replying to.
Yeah, I mean, it's that, you're always going to get people that will abuse tools, and you're always going to get a situation when something's new that people are learning through experience. Like I said before, when I first started podcasting, you just make mistakes, don't you? You don't realize quite the impact of what you're doing until you actually see it play out. And I think there's an element to that. So I think things will get better. I think we're at a stage with AI where there's just a lot of rubbish and a lot of stuff that makes us go, what are you doing that for? I think in time, the majority of sensible people will start to adjust their behavior and realize that actually it might have seemed an exciting idea, but it's really, really naff, right? So I'm not going to do that. And there'll always be a small percentage of people that will always do stuff like that. But, that's life, isn't it?
Yeah. And just finishing up, I wanted to mention, I mean, you mentioned before there's been a couple of challenges on the way. Recently, you've had to change the name of the podcast. Could you give us a brief overview of what happened there and the process, how you came up with a new name, why you had to get rid of the old name, and how easy or difficult you found it to change over?
Yeah, so back end of last year, I received a cease and desist email from a law firm in the US, in Omaha. And Omaha, LinkedIn do have a big office in Omaha, but it wasn't from LinkedIn. It was from a retained lawyer. And I mean, I've been sort of, battling away with LinkedIn on various things for many, many years. And so I guess it shouldn't have come as a big surprise to me. And I knew other people that had been hit by the same thing. So basically what they were saying was that two things. One, you're using the trademark LinkedIn when you shouldn't do that. And two, there's a potential that other LinkedIn members could think that you are representing LinkedIn as a company. And so for that reason, we don't want you to call yourself Mr. LinkedIn, and we don't want you to use the brand LinkedIn Forms, which was the name of the podcast. Now, that podcast name was chosen at the time because I thought, I was being clever in saying, well, it's linked and informed, right? Not LinkedIn formed, because that makes no sense. LinkedIn formed, right? Why would you use the word forms? That means nothing, right? But linked, well, that's to do with, networking, and informed, which is about it telling people, right? So, and informing people. Anyway, you can argue the toss on that all you like, but they don't really care. They've contacted me about similar things many years ago, and the thing used to be that it was always a legal threat, which sounds scary, but in reality, it's not really that scary, right? Because you can put an argument, you could just put an argument back and see where that ends up. This time was different in the very clear threat was, we'll just close your LinkedIn account down. They weren't slow in coming forward with that. It wasn't really that hidden in the message. It was like, we consider what you're doing is outside of the user agreement. And you do realize that if you're outside the user agreement, we can just shut your account down. So there's a clear threat of, we'll just take your account away, which is, frustrating and annoying. And like any human being, when that kind of thing happens, you immediately want to fight, fight or flight, and then you kind of calm down and you think, well, okay, so whatever, and then you start seeing the positive side of that and think, well, maybe a rebrand's not a bad thing anyway. There's plenty of upside to that. And of course, the great thing about podcasting is that you can share such things with your audience, Well, certainly I would always, my first thought to do that, So I went on the podcast, I explained what had happened, and I said, look, it seems unfair, and you think, well, why on earth would they do that when what I do actually supports them in what they're trying to achieve, and and we can get into that, but it's a big company. One person's got a job to do, which is to, make sure that the trademark is not taken by other people or used by other people, sorry. And that's their job. And so they're doing their job, right? So no point in getting annoyed. It's not personal. It is what it is, right? And is it that critical that it has the same name? Is it that critical that the name includes the name LinkedIn? And so I just put that out and asked the audience what they thought. And, loads of people came back with all kinds of suggestions. And the really interesting thing, and really encouraging thing, actually, was that quite a lot of people said, you don't need the name LinkedIn in there because you've established this brand over many years. And when I listen to your podcasts, I'm listening to Mark Williams. That's the bit that matters to me. I know it's about LinkedIn because Mark Williams talks about LinkedIn. That's, we know that. So just call it your name, And I couldn't quite go that far. Just didn't feel like me to call it the Mark Williams podcast or something like that. But someone I think actually a couple of people had suggested Informed, and I thought of it myself as well, briefly. I guess, just thinking about the original name LinkedIn Formed and thinking about the bit out of that was the most relevant word, which was informed, really. So I thought, okay, so I could combine those two things and just say Informed by Mark Williams, right? So that's kind of how we landed up with that, which was announced reasonably recently. And it gave me a chance to kind of refresh the branding and the color of the branding and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And in the description, you can talk about the fact, and it's perfectly legal to do so, provided you say legal to do so. It's perfectly within the user agreement to quote LinkedIn as long as you use the trademark, symbol next to it and all the rest of it.
Okay.
So you can say it's a podcast for LinkedIn users because it is, but you also need to make it clear that it's not LinkedIn themselves type of thing. So that's the story of that. It was a bit annoying at the time, but these things happen, and you just there's no point in trying to fight them. They have the ultimate power to take your account away. So
yes, which would be much worse. But I think you've done a good job. Like, it's still got the in part of it highlighted. I think it's very clear, even to someone who doesn't know you. But the fact that you've spent your time building your personal brand rather than just a brand name, I think has probably made it a lot easier for you.
For sure. But then I suppose the counter argument to that is LinkedIn wouldn't come after you unless you'd already done that anyway. Because if you were just starting out tomorrow and you had no audience, you could probably use any name you want, right? And they wouldn't come after you because they don't care. So it's only at a point where you can stand on your own 2 feet anyway that they would be interested in stopping you. So those kind of things level each other out, really.
Yeah, and then they know they've got you when they threaten you with losing your LinkedIn account when it's got to a certain level, I suppose. But it's
all the people that I know that have been hit with this have all got massive audiences. So, that's where they get interested. It's a kind of compliment in a way, I suppose.
Yeah. Well, it's good for people to think about who haven't really thought about any risks with their name if they're using existing brand names, especially LinkedIn. So thank you. But no, it's been really interesting conversation, and I've learned a couple of things. I'm sure the audience will get a lot out of it, especially if they're LinkedIn users, which most of them, or probably all of them, will be. And if people want to learn more about how they can make the most out of LinkedIn, can they get in touch with you via LinkedIn? Was there anything else?
Yeah, of course.
That they can do?
Absolutely. Go to my LinkedIn profile and feel free to drop me a DM, which is free to do so because I have a premium account, or you can even book a 15-minute call if you've got something that you specifically want to ask about LinkedIn. You'll see links for all of that on my profile. So
cool. And then obviously you've got that free resource out there, Informed, on Spotify and everywhere. It's worth having a listen if you're a user of LinkedIn. You want to learn more. But yeah, thanks again, Mark. It's good to speak with you.
Pleasure. Thanks, Joe.
Thanks for listening to Podcasting Amplified. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to follow or subscribe on your favourite podcast platform. We'll be back next time with another conversation offering more insights to take your podcast to the next level and help you to achieve success. Happy podcasting.